Welcome everyone to today's podcast, The Engineer Whisperer, and we're going to talk about transitions today. And my guest today is Peter. Peter, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm super excited to have you here from the other side of the globe.
Yeah.
So that's also a privilege. Well, before we start, tell us a little bit about you.
So I'm from Australia. I'm from a small town called Armidale. It's in the state of New South Wales, Australia. 25,000 people. There's a university there called the University of New England. Farming area. My parents had a farm machinery business, selling, Massey Ferguson tractors and stuff to the local farming community. I grew up on a BMX bike and a skateboard, because that was a thing that I was really passionate about. Both those sports were evolving in the 70s and 80s, and every month I'd get a magazine called BMX Action, and something new was invented, some new trick, some new technique, some new product. So I guess that got me curious about creativity and innovation from an early stage. And some of the people back then that were my heroes, Bob Haro is an example, the father of freestyle BMX. I actually managed to meet him in California about 4 years ago. And so he's become a good friend and, on WhatsApp, and I'm trying to help him. He's become a DJ in his 60s. Oh, well, he was making electronic music in the 80s, but now he's performing. I'm trying to bring him out to Asia as just a fun sort of side project. So after Armidale, I went off to university in Sydney and studied business, finance stuff, economics. I managed to get a scholarship at KPMG, the accounting firm. And it was kind of a weird thing that happened. My girlfriend at the time was applying to a lot of cadetships where you go to work at an accounting firm, full time, and you go to university part time. And she'd applied to about 50 of them. And I think she got about 5 interviews out of the 50 applications. One of them I remember coming back and said, look, we don't take people out of high school, but we take people who've done 1 or 2 years of university. And I had just finished my first year of university. So I replied to her rejection letter and it turned into a scholarship. So that was kind of maybe an early example of a productive accident or some kind of serendipity that happened. But I learned pretty quickly within about 2 years, I don't really want to be an accounting auditing guy. I don't like checking other people's work. I'd rather be doing something or making something. So I left there, went to a firm called AMP Asset Management, which was an investment firm, worked there for a few years, and then there was an opportunity to go with them to London. And by that stage, my girlfriend had become my wife. And so pre-children, we had this amazing year in 1997 in London and traveled pretty much every weekend. We'd already booked our trip to Paris before we even took off. We went to Barcelona one long weekend. We went to Amsterdam another. We went to Edinburgh another. We went to the Cotswolds. We went to Oxford. We went to Cambridge. Went to everywhere. And then at the end, we traveled around Europe for about 2 months, starting in Ireland and then flying over to Turkey, to Istanbul, making our way across Greece, all around Europe.
Yes.
Including Prague, including Berlin, including
Were you
a whole
actually
bunch of
working or were you just traveling?
On that last bit, we were just traveling, but for the first 6 months we were working, and it was only on the long weekends or weekends that we were taking off. Yeah, but yeah, we did a lot of travel. Then we went back into Australia via Singapore, and there was a reason why I wanted to stop in Singapore. I'd met a couple on one of the bus journeys who were from Singapore. And I was kind of amazed at just how articulate they were. And I said, by the way, what is the national language of Singapore? And they said English. It's actually not English. I think it's Malay. But I was surprised that there was a tiny little country between Malaysia and Indonesia that spoke English so predominantly.
Yeah.
And so that got me curious. And that's why we stopped in Singapore on the way back. That was the week of the financial crisis, 1997 financial crisis. There was a lot of news on I remember watching CNN and Bloomberg TV or whatever it was. Anyway, we moved back to Sydney, and within that first week of arriving, we discovered we were expecting our first child. And we thought, oh, that's perfect. We've got the travel thing out of our system. We'll just settle down and live a normal, regular suburban life in Australia, in Sydney. But 3 years later, we went, you know what? It was more fun living in London. Let's go back there, if not Europe. But long story short, we ended up being offered an opportunity in Singapore. And so the dots connected. We ended up moving to Singapore about October 2001. So it was about a month after September 11, when the world was a little bit fragile. We moved in thinking it would be a 2-year adventure. It turned into 4, 6, 8, 9 years. We had 3 more children that were born in Singapore. Collectively, we studied 3 master's programs. So it was a pretty productive period. But I was bored in Singapore, to be honest, after about 3 or 4 years. It felt like my brain was turning into mashed potato. If you had to leave Singapore to get reconnected with reality, it felt a little bit too like Disneyland. And so I finished an MBA from the University of Chicago in 2010, and within a couple of months, there was an opportunity to move to Hong Kong. And so we did that and didn't really appreciate how difficult it was to shift from somewhere so easy to live, like Singapore, to somewhere that's a little bit grittier and grimy and a little bit edgy. I remember telling our oldest daughter, who was about 12 at the time, I think you're going to like Hong Kong. It's edgy. And I took them up, the 3 oldest kids, on a little backpacking tour of Hong Kong to do all the school interviews. And when they arrived, my daughter sort of looked around. She went, okay, I think edgy is code for shit, because it did look pretty scrappy compared to Singapore, which is pristine. You know, there's wires hanging off the buildings and air conditioning units that surely aren't meeting any safety standards all over Hong Kong. But it took about a year to really settle into Hong Kong. So that was a big change for us. And we took a lot of things for granted. Like in Singapore, most of the apartments have swimming pools and tennis courts and gymnasiums. And, you know, it's like you're living in a resort. You go to Hong Kong and it's like, you know, it's a bit of a step down. You know, you're lucky if you have a car park, and that's about it with most of the buildings. But, you know, we got to love Hong Kong, and I got involved in a lot of creative communities there, including TEDx, and then I discovered Creative Mornings, then I discovered Pecha Kucha, then I discovered Fuck Up Nights, then I discovered the House of Beautiful Business, then I discovered, you know, all these cool little subcultures and the startup community. So I was heavily involved with those. And meanwhile, I'm still working in, I didn't tell you, when I went back to Sydney, just before our first daughter was born, I switched from AMP Asset Management into Citibank. So I know how long I've been working at Citibank because my daughter was born in 1998, and she's nearly 26, and I've just started. I've been with the same firm for 26 years, which is kind of surprising considering all the stuff that I get involved in.
Yes,
I was
yes.
just saying goodbye. Have a good day, Catherine. Love you. Sometimes. And then what else happened? Yeah, so Citibank was good enough to help move us to Singapore and then to Hong Kong. And more recently, in 2022, after 12 years in Hong Kong, we moved back to Singapore, which was a tough decision for the reasons I kind of indicated. I didn't really want my brain to turn into mashed potato again. And I can give you some context around that as a pretty significant transition in our life.
Well, that is why we're here. I mean, thank you for
Exactly.
giving us some context of how many transitions you went through. Because my
Mm-hmm.
question is, what was so far the most challenging one?
Yeah, I'd say the move from Sydney to London didn't feel like a massive leap because it was just the 2 of us. It wasn't so difficult. Moving to Singapore was a bit harder because we had a child. Moving from Singapore to Hong Kong was tough because we had 4 children. We had 3 of them that we needed to find schools for, and so we didn't want to move until we found a place for each of them. But leaving Hong Kong was tricky because we'd been living through the protests for a number of years and then COVID, and Hong Kong was pretty extreme for COVID. You know, it was very restrictive. You know, a lot of quarantine periods, all that. For example, in 2021, it was the year of my father's 90th birthday. So I knew early in 21 that I wanted to get back for his birthday. I knew we were going to have a celebration. I'm the youngest of 6 children. So we were all going to combine for Dad's 90th with our mum as well.
And back in
And
Australia.
back in Australia, yeah. So I booked the flight. It must have been March to fly in November to lock it in. And it was all confirmed. And then 2 weeks before I was going to fly, the airline, Cathay Pacific, cancelled my flight. And I went, well, what's going on? Why would they do that? And so I was scrambling to find any airline that might be able to get me back to Australia. I found Fiji Airways might be possible. And it was going to take me 50 hours to go from Hong Kong to Sydney, but worth it. And then as we were getting closer to the flight, I remember ringing up Fiji Airlines and saying, "Oh, by the way, I'm going to be, on the ground there for like 35 hours. Can I go and play golf? Can I rent a motorbike? Can I go surfing?" And they said, "Well, hang on, but we're only letting citizens come back in at this time." And I'm like, "Well, why did you sell me a ticket?" And then I had to cancel. I had to just ignore that ticket. And by that stage, Cathay had rebooted their booking platform, and I was able to book almost the same flight that I originally had. And for some reason, I was able to book it on frequent flyer tickets, frequent flyer points, even though there were only 50 people allowed on a plane that normally probably holds 500. Somehow I got a frequent flyer ticket. So I managed to get into Australia for my dad's 90th, which was amazing. And while I was there, Hong Kong changed the rules. Instead of having a 2-week quarantine on the way back, they flipped it into a 3-week quarantine. So I was scrambling to try and find, not just to change my airline ticket potentially, but to align the hotel. You had to have the hotel pre-booked because you had to go back into a dedicated quarantine hotel.
Oh, I see. I see.
So initially I said, "Well, can you please extend my stay for another week?" And they said, "No, we can't do that." And then a bit of creative thinking came in, and they said, "Well, if you come back a week earlier, then 1 week plus 2 weeks, that's 3 weeks, we'll let you stay." So I left, I think it was New Year's Eve, 2021, just as we were crossing into 2022. And it turned out to be lucky that we left that time I left that time. It was only me traveling. If it was more than one person, it would have been even harder. And it was lucky that we left at that time because I know 2 of my children and a bunch of friends got COVID New Year's Eve because I guess there were close gatherings and parties and stuff. And if I had been a close contact or if I had have got COVID, I probably would have been stuck there for the next 6 months, whatever. So anyway, I got back to Hong Kong. I go into 3-week quarantine. During that quarantine period, I guess I sort of was paying attention to the media a little bit more than usual. And there was one particular thing that really changed my mind about Hong Kong. They had decided that pet hamsters, were passing on COVID. And so they did an announcement where any child that had a pet hamster had to return their hamster. So 2,000 hamsters were collected and exterminated.
Wow.
And I just went, okay, now what's going to happen? Are they going to take our dog? That would be tragic because dogs are, our dog Frankie is part of our family. That'd be really bad. Anyway, and then another thing happened at our youngest daughter's school. They wanted to, they had a normal pattern where they'd say, "We're going to charge you a deposit in advance for the next school year, just to demonstrate you're going to be here." They turned that deposit into 4 times the usual amount. This is in January to go back to school in August. And I just kind of ignored that because I thought, well, that's ridiculous. And by the way, there's a lot of people leaving Hong Kong, so there's no competition for places. So I'm just going to ignore it. But then, thinking a little bit more, fortunately, work was prepared to relocate people out of Hong Kong because they were getting a little bit nervous about how the direction of Hong Kong with the national security law and all these other political things that were going on. And our lease was coming up. So you put all those things together, it sort of meant it's probably time to. Plus, we had 4 aging parents between my wife and I, plus we had 3 of our 4 children were in Australia by then. My wife hadn't seen our eldest daughter for 2 years. And so we did decide to make the move back to Singapore. But it was tough because, first of all, I went, okay, we don't go until we have our youngest daughter a place in school. I wrote to the school, United World College, which is a really great school here. And they said, yeah, good timing. Applications close in 2 days. This is January for August. So we applied. She was accepted. They said, you've got to pay this deposit within 2 weeks. We did that. Well, we went into denial. I think my wife and I just sort of went, yeah, let's pretend this isn't happening. Because we really didn't want to leave Hong Kong. We had great friends there. We had a good lifestyle despite all the,
Wait, denying all these signs that this is the right time to go now? Is that the denial?
Yeah. Denial of the fact that it probably was the right thing to do, but it was like you're being dragged away from a place that you were having a good time at,
I see.
So, but logically and all the emotional things made it make sense. But we're in denial to the point where, okay, I think we paid the deposit for the school right on the last day. And then as we got closer to, so this was probably February, I guess, 2022, And then there's all this logistics. You basically have to renegotiate your work contract because you're changing country. It's, even though you're staying with the same company, it's a different, entity that you're probably working with, and all of that. And then, we were pretty established in Hong Kong. We had this
A
nice big
community.
community. We had a nice Tesla X that there's no way we'd able to afford somewhere else, because in Hong Kong they had a deal where you could get a car that was electric car for 0% tax at the time. They subsequently went to 90% tax, which was ridiculous. So we had to sell that. Had to sell 4 motorbikes. Had to sell a drum kit. And the people knew, they saw you coming a mile away. Oh, you're one of those people that are leaving. Oh, we're going to give you a shitty price. And, so you get a bit hammered all the way.
Yeah.
And then as we got closer, like our relocation date, I think ended up being middle of June. We were like, do we really want to do this? We were kind of prepared to walk away from the school deposit that we'd paid and all this stuff and just stay. And in my mind, I was predicting a 3 out of 10 experience moving back. So it's like it's a reluctant
Yeah,
move.
you were not happy to
You get the
get
gist.
going. Yes.
Yeah, and
Wow.
you know, we made the move, and happily, a few things exceeded our
So
expectations.
wait. What made you then shift, that you are going
So,
to make the move?
well, I think we just had to we had to just think, okay, this is one of those situations where we're doing something for our parents and for our extended families, and it may not be what we feel the most super excited about, but it's still the right thing to do. So we made the move, and well, one of the first positive things that happened is our son was able to fly out of Sydney from his boarding school and visit us 2 days after we landed. So that was priceless. So already that's a big bonus. It wouldn't have been possible in Hong Kong because you weren't sure whether he could get in or out. They were cancelling flights all the time and stuff. And then we got lucky because it was very tough to find an apartment in Singapore at the time, because there were so many people moving out of places like Hong Kong or Shanghai that demand was exceeding supply. Prices were going crazy. And in fact, the very first day that we landed in Singapore, I think we looked at six apartments with an agent, and it was like you had a 5-minute window to look at the apartment because they had people queued up to go through. This is just a rent at a place, yeah? And none of those places I was super happy about. And I remember writing to the agent at the end of the day saying, look, just for your reference, we don't really like any of them, but if we were going to rank them, this is how we'd rank them. And the first one that I listed, he said, yeah, that one rental has already been rented, and they paid more than they were asking. And I went, no way, it wasn't really a great place.
Wow.
And then the next day, I think we visited our daughter's school. And then the next day, which was a Saturday, we expected the agent to pick us up and take us to a whole bunch of places. And it was, we said, oh yeah, pick us up at 10 a.m. And it was 10:15. He hadn't showed up. I messaged and said, what's going on? He said, well, I couldn't get any appointments to see the apartments. They're all full. The next one I can get you in to see is on Wednesday. And we were in a service apartment for 1 month, and you don't want to exceed that stay because you're going to start paying for yourself, right? So we had to become more proactive in searching for ourselves. My wife found this place online. It looked a little bit too good to be true. And there had been cases of people getting so desperate that they were paying deposits on rental accommodation without even arriving in Singapore. And some of those turned out to be fraudulent. Some of the people that were doing that.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah.
So anyways, this place looked a little bit too good to be true that she found. We sent it to the guy who was helping us, and he said, well, there's a construction site right next door, and they're trying to go en bloc. En bloc means they're trying to sell the building. Like, all of the owners have collectively agreed that they want to sell to make a profit and sell it to some developer. It happens a lot in Singapore.
Okay, but you were
Yeah.
about to rent it, so
Well, yeah, that's another weird thing, right? So Singapore, everything's quite new. They do have heritage buildings as well, but this building was built in 1980 and 1984, and that's ancient in their terms, even though it's quite a modern looking building to most countries. And so we went in and had a look at it on a Sunday, and I think we were lucky. We were the last group to go through, and it was the first day it was open for inspection. And the agent was there, the agent's boss was there, the person doing some renovation was there, and we just stayed for 2 hours and we just hung around. By the end of it, we went, you know what? I think we could make this work. let's make an offer. We made an offer. They accepted. That night we stayed up till 2 a.m. writing you have to write this kind of letter of intent. So we'll rent it on these terms, but you need to fix this, whatever it
Oh,
is,
I
right?
see.
And then the next day they came along and we spent another 2 hours fine-tuning that. And we locked in 3 years. We rolled the dice, even though the building was potentially being sold and we
Yeah.
might be kicked out within 3 months. We said, you know what? That place we were in Hong Kong, it had a term that said you could be kicked out within 3 months all the way through. And we were there for 12 years. So we just decided to roll the dice 3 or 4 months later after moving in. Actually, no, about 7 months later, that en bloc process failed. So we got lucky. So we get to
Yeah.
stay here 3 months. That's right, 3 years.
Wow.
Um,
Peter, just let me stop you for a minute. What an amazing mindset that is, what you just said, that roll the dice. Like, I we might move out, we might be kicked out. A change
yeah,
might happen within 3 months.
yeah.
But right now, I need to make a decision, and I want to make a decision, and I want to make a decision that's gonna serve my family and me
Yeah,
and everybody. I mean, what an amazing mindset to take that risk, like take that calculated risk, I call it.
yeah. Well, I guess we had a bit of history with that in Hong Kong.
Hmm.
And yeah, I guess they got a little bit unlucky with their timing. If they had been maybe 6 months earlier trying to do the same process, I think they would have sold it because there was this really big boost of people coming in. They probably just missed their window, only just, So
Yeah,
we
yeah.
did get
Well,
lucky. And I guess at the end of the day, we could have found another place. It wouldn't have been fun, but maybe we would have avoided this bottleneck because we were coming in June, July, and school starts in August. So there was a bottleneck there. We were
mhm.
seeing places that were advertised. If you were prepared to move in September, October, the prices were lower because we knew there was probably less competition at that stage.
Yes, yes.
It
So
wouldn't have
timing.
been terrible, maybe. It would have been painful, but whatever. Um, so we got in, and the other good thing is it's in a location which is quite central. So when you come and visit, we've got the spare room just over here that you can crash out for a month and use it as your base, right? You can go off to Bali, you can go off to Hong Kong, you can organize some speaking events for you. You can bring, your youngest daughter, your husband and your son whenever you want. So we love having visitors, you know that, right?
I
So
do. I do.
we have a history of, we've got a tradition of having people stay. We've got a bunch of people coming through in coming months and already, Italian colleague, documentary filmmakers, musicians, artists, whoever, right? So,
Well, Peter, let's talk about that mindset of
uh-huh.
that results in having people live in that spare room and come by and be your guests and
Yeah.
be welcome. So where is that coming from for you?
Well, I mean, it evolved. In some ways, it just happened organically. When my parents brought a biography of an Australian lady, Gemma Rice, who had left Australia. Like she grew up close to my hometown, a place called Guyra, where my father was actually from, but half an hour north of my hometown of Armidale. And she was a year or two younger than me, but she'd taken off to Tanzania and was volunteering after finishing high school. Went back to Australia, finished university, and then she went, you know what, I could have a regular career here in Australia. I could go back and do something a bit more meaningful. And someone had donated land to her in Tanzania. Someone donated like $10 to her and said, why don't you go and build a school? And that kicked off, this fundraising initiative. And I was reading her biography in, I think it was 2007. I think she started the school in 2002. She started with 3 children that were selected that had been living in poverty around Arusha in Tanzania. And by the time I was reading the book, she was up to about 700 or 800 students, and they were all doing amazing work coming out of she had very strict criteria on what child was allowed to go attend the school. Had to be a dirt floor. If you had tiles, you're too well off. If you had windows, you're too well off. It had to be a shanty type, If you had more than 2 rooms in your little cabin, you're better off. If you have electricity, no chance, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So she's helping, extreme people. And I was inspired by her book. And at the end of reading it, I wrote to her, there's an email at the back, and I said, this is amazing. Keep up the good work. And by the way, we have a mutual friend that she mentioned in the book. And I didn't think she would read the book or see it. Read
The
my
email.
email, even see it or reply. But it was like I just sent you a WhatsApp. She came immediately back. I think it was evening Singapore time, must have been morning Tanzania. And we just started this conversation. My wife and I and our family sponsored a child. The next month, we got a newsletter saying that they were going to go on a speaking tour of Australia to raise some money. And we just said, well, why don't you come and visit Singapore on the way? You've got to fly via Asia somehow. So she and her, one of her other volunteers, changed their flights. They came, I think, via Dubai. They came and stayed in Singapore for, I think it was only 3 days, but we managed to arrange 5 events. So 3 international schools. She came and I got her to go and speak to a friend who'd left banking, had created an art gallery called Red Sea Gallery. We did 2 evening events, and there was a community center that she spoke at. And the response she got was amazing because, Singapore people are kind of living in a bubble. The living standards are pretty good. And here's someone, doing something pretty amazing, like lifting children and their families and the whole community kind of out of poverty.
Yes.
And so I guess that was a first example of us just inviting someone random that we'd never met before to come and stay with us. And it was a good experience. And then during my MBA, the Chicago program, probably the big idea I got out of that was around how does innovation happen? And there was a professor there, Ron Bird, he went back 100 years. He looked at Henry Ford, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, everyone in between. And he was trying to work out what are the common denominator across these types of people. And he ended up doing a bunch of research and mapping out their social capital. So for instance, like how many different, I don't know, industries were these people connected to? How diverse was their network, et cetera, et cetera. And he kind of worked out that these people, they weren't really inventing anything. They were borrowing other people's, innovations potentially and just repackaging them in new ways. Like I remember reading Steve Jobs' biography, and it talks about when he goes to, I think it's the Fuji Xerox R&D lab or something in California, where they developed this thing where you wiggle this little device on the desk and it makes the cursor move on the computer screen. But they didn't know what to do with it. He was the one that went, that would be pretty cool in my garage. Exactly. Because suddenly you don't have to type code to make the computer work. You can click on an icon and anyone could do that, right?
Yeah.
So that insight alone opened up everything around user interfaces, right? And user experience and everything else. But then Steve Jobs, even though he dropped out of university, he was still curious enough to drop into calligraphy class. And you think, what's that got to do with anything? But that became his inspiration for type fonts. You can either have IBM, PC language, PC font, or you can have about 20 or 30 or 50 or whatever it is on Apple. And that became a differentiator. So, all of these people, did different things with their opportunities. And obviously they were curious. They were very good at eventually finding people that could help them execute their ideas. But what the professor did that was, I think, a gift to the class was distill all of his research into a single phrase. So I remember writing this down. I always write notes when I'm at a lecture. I just like to think and write at the same time. And this sentence jumped out: put yourself at risk of productive accident. So you're putting yourself in a situation where at risk means something interesting could happen. It's not really you're putting yourself at risk of something bad happening. It's either going to be nothing happens or something cool happens. And productive accidents is when serendipity or happenstance or something amazing kind of happens. It's kind of like the fact that we're talking right now, the fact that we met on LinkedIn a few years ago and started this conversation, and now we just introduce people to each other, and we know that's a shortcut for this person has already done the due diligence. This person is relevant to what you're working on.
Yes.
Go and have a chat with them, and then magic might happen,
Yes.
And so I'm sure we could go back and look at all the people we've introduced to each other over the last few years.
Yes.
And the fact that you're going to come and stay here, right? I mean, that just extends the conversation.
Yeah.
But what we learned was when I moved from Singapore to Hong Kong, this idea of productive excellence, that became my decision
So
filter.
you heard it there, and then it stayed with you. You wrote it down, and then
Absolutely.
you like internalized it, and then just decided,
Well,
okay, I'm just gonna make decisions based on this mindset.
I guess it's in some ways, if you think back, we had already done that organically by inviting people from Tanzania to come and stay with it. We had put ourselves at risk of something cool happening.
Yeah, looking backwards now, yes.
Looking backwards. So that's why it resonated so quickly. I went, oh, okay. Now I've got the words for what we just did.
Yeah, like, oh,
We went to Hong Kong.
that's what happened.
Exactly. And then we went to Hong Kong, and I went, all right, I'm going to play with this even more. I finished sort of formal study, but I'm still curious about lifelong learning, and that's where TEDx became involved, and like informal kind of learning. And like I was invited to speak at an event that had nothing to do with my day job. And in my version 0.0 of Peter, I might have said, no, it's got nothing to do with my job. Why would I want to do that? But in version 0.1, where productive accidents was my filter, I said yes, because, you know, they'll learn something they don't know, and I'll learn something about their industry that I don't know. And so that's, to me, that's valuable, as opposed to, like, I don't like the idea of going to a conference where everyone knows 95% of the same stuff. I mean, what's the probability of something interesting happening right there is close to zero. So I would rather have diverse groups come together. Like attending creative mornings for me was a bit of an eye-opener, because when I was living in Hong Kong, I became the president of the Chicago Booth Alumni Club. I got involved in the startup community. There was a bit of mentoring, a bit of angel investing. You know, none of that really did anything special, but it kept this this mindset alive, you know. So and I remember these
Alive,
friends.
and you were sharing it. So I want to add that
Yeah,
you are also someone who, I remember you shared that concept with me on the first phone call that we had. And
yeah,
then I can see you that you, when you meet someone, when you have an opportunity, you share this with them. So it's like you're
for
paying
sure.
it forward.
For sure. You know, the more, like, every person I meet turns into at least one, typically 3 or 5 or 10 collaboration opportunities. Because my framework for having a conversation typically is there's 3 kind of questions. What is your story? You know, not what do you do? Who cares? What are you working on? Like, what projects are you passionate about? And then the third question, which I really love, and it came out of a dinner series that I'm part of, it's you know, how can I help? Like, without expecting anything in return. I love, you know, Adam Grant obviously took this to another level with Give and Take.
Yeah.
There's another book by Bob Berg called the Go Givers instead of a Go Getter. You know, even that is quite subtle, right? Most people think, oh, you want to be a go getter. No, you want to be a go giver. Like, you know, actively go out and help other people, and you know, good things happen, right? Over time, and it
Yeah.
compounds.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
in finance, compound interest is a
Oh,
pretty major concept. I'm
yes.
more interested in compound collaboration. Like, if we introduce each other to different people, and then those people somehow combine and they do something cool, then, you know, things can sort of go exponential over time. And in fact, this idea of productive accidents, um, because I helped curate one of the TEDx talks, 5 of the people I helped out of the 15 became lifelong friends. The local host, Gino Yu, was always introducing me to interesting people. So he was in a university program teaching game development innovation, but he had a kind of a flexible schedule, because he would go off to Davos Economic Forum, then he would go to Burning Man, then he would go to TED Global, and he'd meet cool people and he'd invite them to come back and speak at TEDx Hong Kong. And he got to know me pretty well, and eventually got to the point where on a random Tuesday afternoon at 3:35, he'd just shoot out a note saying, hey, are you in town? And I'm like, yeah, what's going on? And he said, well, we've got this guy in town. He's been couch surfing around the world for 3 years, making a documentary about happiness. You should come. And so whenever I got that type of invitation, I would clear my schedule. I might have calls that night with colleagues in New York or something. Like, I can always reschedule those calls, but I can't reproduce this opportunity.
Yes.
So I
Yeah.
remember going to that dinner and meeting this filmmaker. His name's Adrian Bellick, and it turned out he grew up on a BMX bike. So we had something to talk about for an hour. Then I asked him about his theories of happiness and, you know, his tours around the world. And at the end of the night, I said, look, you're a couch surfer. Where are you staying tonight? And he said, I'm all right tonight, but tomorrow. And I said, all right, come and stay at our place. I just spare of the moment, I said, you've got to come and stay. So I went up the escalator in the middle of Hong Kong to mid-levels where we were living, and I approached my wife. I said, by the way, I've just invited this dude with dreadlocks to come and stay with us for a couple of weeks. Are you okay? And fortunately, Catherine said, yeah, why not, right? And Adrian became one of our, you know, lifelong friends very quickly, because lovely person. I even found a copy of his movie called The Happy Movie. We did a pizza and beer screening with about 20 friends the next evening. He did a Q&A off the back of that. What I discovered is when you have people stay with you, you get to hang out more. They get to see what it's like to live in your city. The priceless piece was for our children. They kind of had this living library of people that were coming through. And the best bits are probably when I'm not there, they're getting to have a conversation with somebody that's living a completely different life, and
Yes.
hopefully opening up their minds to, oh wow, maybe I could make a film, or maybe I could be a nomad, maybe I could
Yeah,
whatever.
just it's the opportunities are endless because of this vast place of in our
Yeah,
mind where I never thought about it. And
yeah,
that is that big ocean where you don't know what you don't know until you meet someone
exactly.
like, oh wow.
Absolutely.
You,
And it turns out humans are pretty cool. They're not all murderers, they tend to be pretty normal. And, so in 1 month alone, I think it was the following year, we had the documentary filmmaker come and crash with us again. We had a musician out of Melbourne. We had a guy from the Maasai tribe in Tanzania that was working at the school that we were supporting. He came through as a speaker, and we hosted an event to raise some awareness and funding for what they were doing. So just in 1 month, we had so many cool people.
so how to say it? You went from you sent an email to a lady, then you
Hmm.
replied back, she came and visited you, then in the class you wrote down one sentence, and then it's like I'm gonna live by this mindset, I'm gonna
Absolutely.
live it.
Yeah.
And then you haven't mentioned yet that you also wrote a book
Yeah,
where it
yeah.
has a collection of all these stories in it
Yeah. I mean,
and
I
more.
do, thank you for setting this up, but that is the book that I wrote. And I wanted to learn how to self-publish. So I did it all, by myself. I didn't even think about using a regular publisher because I wanted to learn end to end. How do you write a book? How do you get it printed? How do you get it onto Kindle? How do you create an audiobook? How do you do everything end to end, right? So it's been a bit of an adventure. So I've called it Productive Accidents, but no surprise, because within 4 years of living in Hong Kong, that one mindset had led to so much content, I had to write it down. It takes 5 hours to explain everything that happened. And then the subtitle, which I think is relevant, is it's, to me, this idea of productive accidents is, yes, it's good for creativity and innovation, but it also turns your life into an adventure. So my book is called Productive Accidents, but the subtitle is A Playbook for Personal and Professional Adventure, because probably my whole mindset has evolved into the ideal career is where what you do for work and what you do for fun are indistinguishable. So there's a lot of people that don't think I work because I'm quite deliberate at reverse engineering. You're an engineer whisperer. I like to reverse engineer any trip, any travel to amplify the adventure that can
Yes.
happen from that. And there's
Yes.
so many examples of that. I'm doing a self-funded trip to New York on the 17th of May, so a couple of weeks from now, and I'm already reverse engineering. I've already ordered a BMX bike for my children in Melbourne, but the shop in the US wouldn't send it overseas. So I said, send it to my friend in Short Hills. I'll pick it up. I'll ride it around Manhattan for that week. And I'm taking my electric skateboard as well. And the Distinguished Gentleman's Ride, which is a motorbike ride raising money for men's health, just happens to be on the Sunday that I'm there. So I'm doing that as well.
So this is why I wanted you on my podcast, is this
Right.
mindset of re-engineering and bringing adventure and risk-taking back in your life in a way
Yeah.
that creates these um accidental yes
Yeah.
and intentional. It's the
Well,
whole part of
yeah.
engineering it in and living like it, bringing it into your forefront where you're thinking about it. So
Mm,
it's like being intentional of not having plans, of being intentional of leaving opportunities for you in your life to meet people, to invite them in,
for
to go
sure.
places, to discover things that otherwise you would have not discovered because you're
Yeah.
thinking, as you said, it's not part of my job. I don't know, I'm not getting paid for it. I'm not
Yeah.
getting anything for it. So versus the mindset of it's part of my life.
Hmm.
I have something to give and
Yeah.
I'm a giver and I will give value. I know I can give value to whomever I'm meeting because
Yes.
people are good and kind,
Yeah.
and that's how I want to live and that's how I choose to live. So,
100%. And what happened was, this book kind of starts in Singapore and talks about moving to Hong Kong and what happened next, right? So now I've got an idea to write the reverse. We've just moved from Hong Kong. We've moved back to Singapore. We've been here 2 years. I've got a Google document with the exact same chapter headings, because the chapter headings have become um, the actionable insights that anyone
oh,
could apply in any
mhm.
community, whether you're living in New
Yeah,
York or Singapore or Hong Kong or a tiny town called Armadale or anywhere.
Yes.
So maybe I'll read out those chapter headings because it just shows how basic they really are, right? So the
Sure.
first chapter is just repeating the piece of the mindset or the filter for making decisions. Put yourself at risk of productive accidents. Just keep that in mind. The next one is embrace playful experiments. I'm a big fan of being playful, being also semi-scientific. You think about high school, you have a hypothesis, then you've got to work out, okay, how do I prove that that hypothesis is true or not? I need to come up with an experiment that will give me data to demonstrate, is it true or is it false?
Yeah.
If it's false, discard. If it's true, do more of it, iterate. Volunteer for causes you care about. I didn't appreciate how important it was to find a cause that you care about. So overcoming poverty and becoming, promoting education to everyone, giving equal access is a recurring theme, right? Entrepreneurship is another, empowerment, the environment, I'm a big fan of alliteration. I've got 5 E's. I can't remember all of them, but let me think of it. Equality, education, empowerment, entrepreneurship, and the environment. Bonus points for alliteration. Explore your community. And one way to do that is discover all these little grassroots community or creative groups. TEDx is a great gateway, but then I discovered the startup community. Then I mentioned the other ones, Creative Mornings, Pecha Fuck Up Nights, etc. Pursue lifelong learning. It's a no-brainer, whether you're doing formal or informal learning. Create a portfolio of personal projects. So I'm always trying to tinker around and make stuff and come up with weird little, projects. Collect and share stories. So stories, I wouldn't have written a book if it wasn't for a guy, Craig Wortman, who is a professor. He was at Chicago Booth, now he's at Kellogg. He wrote a book called What is Your Story? And he was doing a webinar at work. And I thought, well, it's interesting that he's talking about stories. Now stories are everywhere, but 15 years ago, it was quite innovative for him to be talking about it. I purchased his book on Kindle. I read the introduction on the way to work. 3 sentences changed the way I think about a lot of things. Stories are your most valuable asset. They are more important than facts. If you don't write them down, they did not happen. And that last one jumped out at me for various reasons. I won't go into them now, but I can talk
leave
about
some
some other
surprise
time.
for those who's gonna pick up.
Absolutely. Be a generous go-giver. So don't be a go-getter, be a go-giver.
Yep.
Invent systems and traditions. So having people come and stay with us has become a tradition.
Yes.
It's a recurring theme, right?
I love that one.
So I'm a big fan of systems, and I know you're a fan of goals. In my view, systems trump goals, because if you apply a system consistently, you exceed any concept of goals anyway. But
Yeah.
we can debate that anytime. Build an authentic network. LinkedIn is a great playground for meeting like-minded people across all those creative communities. Or, like, I'm not an engineer, so you're my gateway into engineers, right? If I have any question about engineers, you are my expert. You're like on my board of directors. If I need someone to talk about engineering, I go to you. If I need someone to talk about developing a charity in Tanzania, I go to, my friend over there, Gemma.
Yeah.
If I need to know something about making a documentary, I go to talk to my mate who, couch surfed around the world, all that stuff. And then in the end, you want to connect the dots. How do you make all of this make sense? And, writing the book was a useful exercise, because writing rewires your brain and you start to see new possibilities.
Yeah.
So, a whole bunch of things kind of happened, including like just being alert. So when we were still living in Singapore, when we were supporting the school in Tanzania, our eldest daughter was at the school, United World College. They had a guy called John Wood come in and talk. And John Wood, I didn't know about him at the time. He'd written a book called Leaving Microsoft to Change the World. And it turns out he has literacy programs where he was trying to teach 1 million children how to read and build 1,000 libraries. So pretty ambitious sort of stuff. I met him at the school presentation. We got on pretty well. We stayed in touch. Turns out when we moved to Hong Kong, he had also moved to Hong Kong. We ended up becoming pretty good friends. He wrote the foreword to my book. And when he's finished with Room to Read, he's passed on the CEO after 20 years. He had taught, I think it's over 20 million children how to read, and he'd built 37,000 libraries. Some of them, I think, are just like a box on the back of a motorbike riding between villages in India. And he's now on to a second project called U-Go, which is creating opportunities for women in places like the Philippines to go on to university. Yes, they can read, but now they're taking it to another level. And he's already raising thousands of scholarships for women. So he's an amazing guy. And the fact that he was willing to be my pro bono writing coach is also kind of a productive accident, right? But it evolved.
Yeah, but these are the people that I always think they come in your life because, again, starting with if you're a giver, you're gonna get that back. This is what I believe in.
For
So,
sure.
those who don't believe it, again,
Well, let me continue the theme on what happened next, right, with the whole volunteering thing, because it went a bit exponential.
we're
One of the
we're up to closing though, so I want
it'll
to.
be quick.
Yes.
So one of the women I helped with her TEDx talk, she's a musician, had a scholarship from Yale, obviously very good. She did a talk about overcoming perfectionism, and because it turns out if you're a perfectionist, and she ended up not liking music after a while. Then she discovered golf, and she realized it doesn't matter what you do with golf, you can never be perfect. So that gave her a gateway back into music. She started creating concerts for charity. So we collaborated and did one with our friend from the Maasai tribal guy from Tanzania. Then she and her husband were offered a job in New York. Somehow I met a guy who runs concerts at Carnegie Hall for humanitarian causes, 100-piece orchestras. My motivation was to try and get her to perform at that concert. Turns out that she's good, but he had the choice of, probably 50 different clarinet players, and he chose one of the others. But she ended up hosting the after party for one of their concerts. Fast forward, I was invited to go on the board of Music for Life International in New York. And the first concert we put on was for United Nations and their efforts to end violence against women and girls. I mean, even all of that is just bizarre that I was involved in that, right? I'm some dude in Singapore working in a bank, but I'm helping him promote this concert. And I traveled across with my wife, two daughters, my parents-in-law. Then I invited the founder of that concert series to come back to Hong Kong to speak at TEDx. He did a great job. A month later, he said, by the way, the woman that coached him to do his talk is starting an NGO. I should meet her for a coffee. I met her, and within half an hour, I could tell she was creating the conditions for productive accidents. Fast forward, I went on the board of her charity called Resolve Foundation, and it's amazing. Like I've since retired. I was on it for about 5 or 6 years, but to go on the board of that, Music for Life, Resolve Foundation, and then Ladies Recreation Club, all those things kind of compounded. And I learned more from being on the board of NGOs than I did from my day job, because it was about governance, it was about strategy, it was about fundraising, it was about a whole bunch of stuff. And that all was just one side project that happened as a productive accident. There were like 20 others that people can read about. So you get the gist.
I do. I read the book, and I can tell that it changed how I think. It changed my mindset, and hearing about productive accident and put yourself at risk. Like I know that that made a change in my life. So I don't know if I ever told you that, but yes, thank you very much for creating
Well,
impact
I
in
have a
my life
feeling that
as
your
well.
podcast might be an example, right? You sort of went outside your comfort zone, and magic
Yeah.
is being made. So
Yes.
congratulations.
Yes, it was from an idea, and yeah, collaborating with the first guest. So uh it's people are amazing. That is my belief as well, and reaching out to them um can be.
Oh, I have one more thing I need to talk about, because remember I said it was going to be a 3 out of 10 experience in Singapore?
Yes.
One good thing that happened in Hong Kong that didn't happen when we were here, we had our motorbike license in Hong Kong, riding a Vespa around. Having a Vespa in Singapore took the score from a 3 to an 8, because now Singapore feels a little bit more like Hong Kong. I can zip from
Oh.
home to tennis to skateboarding to BMX to wherever on the Vespa. Then the other thing that took it even higher was, finding this place to live so quickly, and then getting into this Tangling Club, which is great for tennis. It's just around the corner. So it basically, and then the fact that we could travel and to see family and everything, it basically took Singapore from a 3 out of 10 to an 8 out of 10 to an 11 or a 12. So it all worked out. Despite all the reservations and all that other stuff, making the transition was a positive outcome.
And I think it's because you started with the 3, and then the mindset was there to look for other points, for what else is important, what else do I want in my life.
I wasn't really sure how it was going to turn out. I underestimated the importance of having the Vespa. It made a massive difference here.
Just like anybody else, Peter, that
Yeah, for sure.
we underestimate, and we don't see things until they're right in front of us.
And the other
Well,
priceless thing was I was able to go back and see my family, my parents 4 times in that first year. My father did pass away July 23. So if we hadn't have done the move from Hong Kong, that wouldn't have been feasible. And that would have been tragic, right? So to be able to get back and see both parents and my wife's parents and our children, as you know, it's a no-brainer with the benefit of hindsight.
Yes, yes. Well, transitions are painful, as you started the conversation. And then we start managing it. And that's my belief, that if you manage your transition, then you're going to manage the change.
Yeah.
Well, we are at the end. We're a little bit over. So thanks everyone who's still with us and listening. So Peter, I usually give the mic back to my guests to close us out. So what do you want to leave us with today?
Well, my extension of the phrase is put yourself at risk of productive accidents, trust the process, and wait for the magic to happen. And with that mindset, it will unlock cool things, and just play with it. The next time you get invited to go to something that is slightly outside your normal sphere of activities, just give it a go and just be observant and patient, and cool things will keep happening.
Awesome. And Peter, if someone got inspired to connect with you, what's the best way to connect with you?
Yeah, just go to LinkedIn and send a note, say, hey, I saw you on this podcast. It'd be great to have a chat. As simple as that. Anything more, like 10 paragraphs with links and stuff, I'm going to ignore. But just a short personal note, say, hey, I saw you on Andrea's podcast. Be cool if we could connect anytime. So Peter Williams is quite a common name, so I put my middle initial in there, Peter B. Williams.
Yes.
And yeah, I'm happy to connect with anyone and start a conversation.
I'll add it to the show notes. So
awesome.
On that note, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's been great to catch up.
And thanks for sharing. And
always, anytime.
yes.
And book your ticket. What are you waiting for?
I am waiting. I'll tell you offline. Well, thank you everyone for listening. And until next time, reach out to Peter. That is my advice. Well, thank you everyone.